when I was growing up, we would say the rosary, and then my father and mother would pile 8 or 9 or 10 kids onto the big bed, and my dad would read the lives of the saints. The patron saint in our household was St. Francis. We had a shrine to him in the garden, and he was my favorite saint because of the way that he lived his life and the affection that he had for nature and for creation. He put an intense value on all life. If he saw a branch that was in the fire and it had a worm on it, he would pull it out and walk the worm away. He saw God in every part of creation, in the trees and the birds and the leaves. He was always had this hero inside of him, and he went off to war, captured by the neighboring city of Perugia, and put in jail with a lot of the other soldiers from Assisi for a year. But when he was in there, he became very, very well known for always taking care of people who were sick, always sharing his food with other people. He heard a voice at one point summoning him to a life committed to God. And he believed at that time that that meant joining the Crusades. So he had already fought in a war heroically, and he armed himself and went off to join the Crusades. But on his way, he passed 3 lepers on the road. And leprosy at that time was the most feared disease. And the lepers, in fact, were not allowed to approach towns. They lived by themselves in the woods. They had to legally ring a bell everywhere they went to warn people to run. People knew that it was contagious. They didn't know much about it, but they were horrified by it. It was a very, very bad way to die. And St. Francis himself has these lepers. He had a feeling of deep, deep remorse and empathy for them. And he forced himself to do something that was utterly counterintuitive. He got off his horse and he went to the beggars and he kissed them each. And then he realized that this was his calling, to care for the most alienated, the most vulnerable, the most miserable, the most dispossessed members of humanity. And he went off to live in the woods. He gave away all of everything that he owned, including his clothing, and he wore a sackcloth. And he went off to live with the lepers and to take care of them. And something very strange happened. Within a few years, there were 20,000 men living in the woods, giving their lives to the poor because of his example. And he ended up being part of this this transition in history when we moved from the Dark Ages to the Renaissance, to the period of enlightenment. But he saw that the church had become possessed by interests of power, by orthodoxies that were serving the powerful, that it was speaking a language, Latin, which Christ hadn't spoken. It was the language of power. It was the language of empire, that people were denied direct access to God, that if you wanted to know what God wanted of you, you had to ask a priest, who has to ask the Monsignor, who has to ask the bishop, who has to ask the archbishop, who has to ask the cardinal, who has to ask the pope, and it comes back down. So it was a very vertical system. And Francis thought we all ought to have access to God. And he told people that God talks to us through many vectors, including laughter, poetry, music, which he loved. He never stopped singing or playing his instruments, and of course, more vividly, with more texture and grace and joy through creation. And that God is talking to all of us. And he also thought most people were illiterate at that time, and there were no printing presses. So if you wanted to know a Bible story, you had to ask the priest to read you the Bible, because there was only one in your town if you were lucky. And he decided to recruit painters to paint Bible stories on the walls of the churches. And these became the first painters of the Renaissance. And he preached to the Crusaders and asked them to go back to their homes, and they ignored him. So he crossed the lines and to preach to the Sultan, expecting that, of course, that he would be killed. But the Sultan, Al-Malik, fell in love with him. and asked him to remain in his court. And then when Francis refused, he gave him a safe passage throughout all Muslim lands. So it was really an extraordinary time with relevance to our today as well. One of my favorite expressions of St. Francis, if a thief steals your shoes, you should run after him and give him your socks. Oh, everything that he did was counterintuitive, and it was a way of turning evil into good, bringing order out of chaos. And he believed that our mission here for people who are Christians was to live their lives in perfect imitation of Christ, which was not necessarily to pay attention to all the orthodoxies, but rather to go to the Gospels where we're told to love each other, to be kind to the poor. I think we're going to see the unraveling of the war machine, an investment in communities and in health and wellness centers in all of our rural areas where people can go to recover from addiction and to get reparented in the skills of living in a community. We're going to see the end of the chronic disease epidemic, which has given our country, made our country the sickest country in history from chronic disease, the sickest country in the world today. And we're going to see people begin rebuilding their own faith and in the integrity of the institutions of our government. And those government, I am going to change those agencies so that they're no longer predatory against the American people, but begin again to serve the American people and become templates and role models for institutions around the world. And I'll close just with a prayer of St. Francis, which he wrote now 800 years ago. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, joy. And where there is darkness, light. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It's in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it's in dying that we are born to eternal life.